Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. The Russians have managed to advance within the Siversk section of the front line as well as the northern flank of Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians continue their counteroffensive, as well as to the south of Pokrovsk and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. They've also managed to regain some territory in the Sumy region. It is clear that the Ukrainians have initiated a complete counteroffensive following the rotation of their forces from other sectors of the front line to the Pokrovsk section, where their reinforcements are spread from the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region to the northern flank of Pokrovsk. The Russians are attempting to face the Ukrainian counteroffensive head-on, but are facing initial difficulties due to the strong force the Ukrainians are using in this counterattack. The Ukrainians rotated upwards of 10,000 soldiers to this section of the front line to initiate this counterattack, and it was a quick rotation using much of their elite forces that they likely have prepared for a new offensive, which is now being directed to the Pokrovsk direction. The Ukrainian counterattacks are centered around the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they've managed to regain control over some positions within Zeleny High and regain control over Andrivka Klevtsove. The Ukrainians managed to push the Russians out of some positions within the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk and contesting other areas southeast of the city. On the northern flank, they managed to secure the highway leading into Pokrovsk northwest of Rodinsk as the Russians continued their pressure on the eastern parts of the city. The Ukrainians continued offensive operations further south from Solodyi along the frontline positions and the main push of the Ukrainians near the spearhead of the Russian offensive, while the Russians managed to secure their positions in this direction. Looking at the spearhead directly, the Russians, after the Ukrainian counterattack, withdrew from some of these positions while the Ukrainians are fighting at them. At the same time, they improved their positions by strengthening and consolidating their positions in the fortified areas on the western and eastern parts of Decisive and entrenching themselves within the town. The Ukrainians have been attempting to counterattack on the flanks, but have so far been unsuccessful with encircling the Russian positions in the area. The Russians are building up their forces on the northern spearhead, which is a difficult position due to the lack of positions alongside the road leading up to Decisive that the Russians have control over. The Russians are playing a big risk here, attempting to hold their positions and facing off against the Ukrainian forces, counterattacking here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, as they do not have stable positions. They have the high ground positions and the forest lines that lead up to it, but all of these areas are vulnerable to Ukrainian counterattacks from areas such as Shechove, Donetsk, Vilna, and Novoshakhove, where the Ukrainians can build up their forces and counterattack on the flanks. It will be difficult for the Russians to hold these positions. It could be a counterattack to open up the road for their forces to withdraw. It could also be a counterattack where they're looking to build up their forces and double down on their offensive operations. We will see over the coming days how these situations develops and how well the Russian positions here are entrenched and consolidated, while the Ukrainian ability to counterattack is still strong in localized areas where they concentrate their elite forces. So the Russians are in for a tough couple of days and weeks if they are looking to hold their positions north of the city. The Ukrainians also managed to regain control of the fortified positions here in the northwestern flank of Rodinsk, where they're pushing back the Russian forces from the railway area onwards towards Sukhetsk and Sechishok here on the eastern flank. The Ukrainians are here looking to secure the highway that leads into the city of Pokrovsk from the northern direction. By regaining control of these fortified positions, the road has reopened. The next step of the Ukrainians is to re-secure Rodinsk by kicking the Russians out of the city and counterattack in the direction of Chervony Liman, Sukhetsk, and Sechishok here towards the Kasantye-Turets River. While the Russians are looking to double down on the offensive operations towards Rodinsk to gain control of it, which will securely cut off the main highway leading into Pokrovsk from the north, and to secure the positions along the defensive lines here west of Soretsk and Rodinsk. These are anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, which also limits the Ukrainian counterattack abilities in the eastern direction. That's why the front line has aligned alongside it. The Russians are working on defensive lines here to the north and in the direction of Rodinsk, where they're looking to gain control over the city, which will secure the western flank for the offensive operations in the northern and southern directions. To the south of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians recaptured the southwestern residential area of the city, and they also managed to recapture the forest patch area, which means if there are any Russian soldiers remaining within the city, the main supply lines will not be cut off, while fighting continues over Troyanda, the settlement here just south of Pokrovsk, where the Russian and Ukrainian forces are clashing. There's also clashes in the residential area just outside the Shakhtarsky district and within the town of Chunshina, as well as fortified positions in between the two areas. The Russians are looking to consolidate their positions here on the southern flank of the Shakhtarsky district area to start offensive operations towards it, or to isolate it from the western parts, where the Russians are looking to gain access to the city itself, gain control over the TO406 highway, and cut off the E50 highway supplying the Ukrainian forces in the main frontline positions. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Ukrainians managed to re-enter Sumy yet again, and also managed to regain control over Decisive. The Ukrainians here launched counterattacks following the arrival of reinforcements, same reinforcements that arrived in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, to consolidate their positions here in the northwestern parts of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Consolidating their positions within Decisive and Sumy prevents the Russians from establishing a front line along the river line, which would secure their positions for further offensive operations towards the defensive lines in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. Therefore, the Ukrainians are really choosing the best time to launch their counteroffensive. Delaying it any further would further secure the Russian positions here in the southwestern outskirts and on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, which could have had irreversible effects on these frontline positions. As said, the timing the Ukrainians made to launch their counterattack is exactly at the point where the Russians were near their victory. This significantly delays the results of the Russian offensive operations in the area. The Russians will now be looking to consolidate their positions and strengthen their positions for further offensive operations once they secure their positions of a Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainian counterattack is just near the start. It will take a long time before their forces are used up, especially considering their positions are all in areas where the Russians are some areas overstretched, other areas not well defended. All of these fortified positions the Russians have captured in these areas are facing the Russian direction, not the Ukrainian direction, which means that they are not very useful for the Russian forces defending against Ukrainian counterattacks. They haven't had enough time to build new fortifications or to entrench themselves in the different areas. Therefore, the Ukrainians are counterattacking at a very decisive moment, but there's also the question as to whether or not these forces that have been rotated are enough for any larger scale counterattacks that could secure Pokrovsk or the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, rather than just delay the Russian progress. At the same time, we have other sectors of the front line, just as Shentinivka, Siversk, Liman, Kupiansk, and the Sumy regions, which also have to be considered into the larger picture. Speaking of the Siversk direction, the Russians have now gained full control over Serebryanka. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians have gained full control over the town and have been geolocated on the western outskirts of it. With full control over Serebryanka, the battle over the northern defensive line of Siversk can begin. Russians gain control over this defensive line will allow them to start offensive operations towards Siversk itself from the northern and eastern flanks. This will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions in the Siversk section of the front line. Gaining control over the town will allow the Russians to secure the southern flank of the Serbyansky forest area, which will allow them to gain control over the remaining parts of it, here along the eastern bank of the Serbets river line, and will strengthen the Russian offensive operations capabilities in the direction of Liman, going further westward, and the northern flank of Bakhmut for offensive operations towards the Slovyansk-Shentinivka line from the eastern direction. In the Sumy region, the Ukrainians have managed to make new progress. They managed to regain control over Vereshchine yet again. It is a very small village. It's difficult for either side to consolidate the positions and strengthen fortifications or entrench themselves within it. The Ukrainians not just recaptured the village, but also managed to push to the forest line to the north of it on the eastern flank of Novomykolaiivka. This points towards further counterattack operations by the Ukrainians beyond that of Andreevka and Vereshchine, to the direction of Novomykolaiivka, Oleksivka, and Volodymyrivka. The Ukrainians may look to regain control over the areas all the way from the western outskirts of the Russian Sumy incursion all the way to Volodymyrivka and Novomykolaiivka. The threat on Novomykolaiivka will allow the Ukrainians to threaten the main supply line leading into Oleksivka, which is a larger town and well-fortified position of the Russians here in the western parts of the Sumy incursion, while Novomykolaiivka is a smaller town that is less fortified. If the Ukrainians are able to gain control over that, they'll be able to cut off the supply route leading into Oleksivka, weakening the Russian positions in the area to gain control over both that and Novomykolaiivka. While the Russians are bogged down in the direction of Yunakivka, still not gaining full control over the town, the Ukrainians continue to develop counteroffensive operations here in the western parts of the Sumy region, where the Russian positions are not as well supplied and as powerful as the eastern direction. This shows yet again how the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the vicinity of Sumy is very powerful, while the Russian offensive capabilities are very limited. This is mainly due to the limited logistical capabilities of the Russian forces. The main logistical hub of the Russians in this section of the front line is Sucha. Sucha was occupied by the Ukrainians for almost an entire year. This process, due to artillery shelling and fighting, left Sucha in dire straits. This limits the supply capabilities of the town for the Russian forces. At the same time, the Ukrainians have the city of Sumy as their main logistical hub in the area. The Ukrainians can simply concentrate way more forces than the Russians are capable of in this area. With them consolidating their positions following their initial Russian incursion, they have been able to stabilize the front and now launch counterattacks continuously. This is reminiscent of the Russian Kharkiv incursion, where the Russians only managed to gain positions along the border area. Despite the close proximity of Belgorod city to Kharkiv city, we see that the Russians were more balanced in terms of supplies in the Kharkiv direction compared to the Sumy direction, which shows that the Russian positions in the Sumy direction are even worse off than in the Kharkiv direction, and the Russians have not been able to successfully capture positions in any significant way since May of 2024. In the eastern section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians have initiated a new counteroffensive, while the Russians continue their own offensive operations as they have been, while the Ukrainians also continue their counterattacks in the Sumy direction. The Ukrainian elite and Zelensky himself are stating that they expect a Russian offensive to take place in the eastern section of the front line as well as the southern section of the front line in the coming days. This is one of the justifications for the rotation of forces to the southern section of the front line, to improve their positions ahead of a Russian offensive. If you want to better understand the importance of these logistical hubs such as Pokrovsk and the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, which the Ukrainians are rotating their best forces to defend, make sure to check out this video on the screen right now, where I discuss the three phases of the Russian summer offensive as well as the tactics that the Russians have been using over this recent times that allowed for the initial Russian breakthrough and now the consolidation of positions in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.